of innocence, but the call for terrorism and the terrorist crime and accusing people of terror based on their opposition to political regimes, which has caused them to leave their homes. So therefore, we see a lot of human defenders, activists, and even female activists. In fact, they were accused of terror and intelligence with countries. And these are severe accusations. And of course, they are only because they are only defending human rights. So today, after 20 years and after this years, have we gone far in combating terrorism? Is there a genuine development in combating terrorism? So, all of us and the participants, we think that we still are far away from eradicating terror. Is there any problem? So maybe the microphone is open. Your microphone is open. So there's a mic which is open right now. So today we are going to deal the situation of human rights within terror, especially after 20 years. We cannot say now and pretend that humanity and countries, they have achieved successes in this. So let's start with the intervention with Nino Hicks, who is a director and the former director of the human rights, and he was the director. Mr. Nino has followed the policies of human rights and the human rights activities in different. Mr. Nino, do you have any problem? Mr. Massimo Frigo, do you receive the translation in English? Yes. So he was interested in human rights conditions in Russia, Thailand, Russia, Indonesia, and Uzbekistan. So Mr. Nino also led human rights for its engagement with the Obama administration's Countering Violent Extremism initiative. Mr. Nino, please, you have the floor. 10 minutes, you got 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining the panel. So my paper deals with the impact of counterterrorism policy on the human rights situation in the Middle East and North Africa region over the last 20 years. So after 9/11, many governments, democratic and undemocratic alike, turned their back on human rights in the name of what they hoped would be enhanced security. My paper describes 5 trends discernible since the early years of the post-9/11 global effort to counter terrorism that, far from enhancing security, have made counterterrorism policy into a relentless. These 5 trends are: firstly, equating human rights defenders with terrorists. Secondly, militarization and securitization that have intensified civil conflicts, worsening violence to disastrous levels. Thirdly, the weakening of state-to-state peer pressure in the sense of governments urging other governments to respect human rights standards. Fourthly, proliferation of sweeping counterterrorism laws, often attributable to the vague and expansive definition of the term terrorism itself. And fifthly, the outsized impact of the United States counterterrorism policy. Finally, my paper looks at different ways that counterterrorism policies have contributed to worsening human rights conditions in contrasting specific countries in the region, specifically Tunisia, Syria, and Egypt, showing how in different ways counterterrorism measures have undermined human rights everywhere, but acutely in the Middle East and North Africa region. So to say a little more about each of these trends. Labeling non-violent critics, including human rights defenders, as terrorists is doubly damaging. It enables governments to curtail basic freedoms, thereby contributing to the shrinking of civil society space, a much commented on trend in recent decades. And silencing critics and those who seek to hold governments accountable has contributed to impunity, an absence of accountability for the authorities that commit violations. Secondly, counterterrorism has fueled devastating military conflicts across the Middle East and North Africa region. Massive military intervention in Iraq led to a violent reaction in the form of the rise of the Islamic State. Counterterrorism is a pretext for regional and extra-regional military interventions in Yemen, Syria, and Libya. Thirdly, the international community, notably in the form of the United Nations Security Council, has been paralyzed in its response to mass atrocities and wholesale violations of international law, especially in Syria. The United States and Western powers, having been exposed for their misuse of counterterrorism to justify the Iraq invasion, have deferred to claims to be acting to counter terrorism by Russia, Saudi Arabia, or the United Arab Emirates, and by authoritarian states across the region. The deprioritization of human rights within the UN counterterrorism system shows further how authoritarian states have seized control of the counterterrorism file to advance their own interests. On the question of expansive laws, post 9/11, states were required by a series of UN Security Council resolutions to adopt laws to counter terrorism. Regional states interpreted the call for strong measures as a vindication of existing draconian legislation. These calls gave a green light to the expansion of restrictions on basic freedoms. Absence of safeguards has facilitated serious violations like enforced disappearances, torture, arbitrary detention, and the serious violations and other serious violations by shrouding state actions in secrecy. Finally, the harmful US example. The Bush administration bound together human rights, democracy promotion, and anti-authoritarianism with its counterterrorism strategy, to the great detriment of the former. On the one hand, the United States adopted a security strategy that flouted basic principles of human rights law by, for example, condoning the use of torture, while at the same time claiming to be a global champion of human rights and freedom. The credibility of human rights themselves suffered from its association with the US government's war on terrorism. Over time, prioritization of security cooperation designed to keep terrorism away from the United States and its allies amounted to showing indifference to the lives of people in the region, tens of millions of whom live in conflict zones, have suffered displacement, or have lost their livelihoods as a result of the war on terrorism. This points to the counterproductive impact of 20 years of global counterterrorism policy. There is less regional stability, more ungoverned and loosely governed areas, and terrorist groups with grievances against the West benefit from these conditions. Three brief country examples show how counterterrorism has undermined human rights in different ways. Beginning with Egypt Egypt is a classic example of an autocrat, in this case, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, using the politics of fear to justify a severe crackdown on human rights in the name of fighting terrorism. It is alarming the extent to which this approach has worked. And one of the reasons why Sisi has been able to consolidate his power is that democratic political leaders lose their ability to speak honestly and critically when confronting human rights violations in the name of counterterrorism. Secondly, Syria was an example of the invocation of counterterrorism to block efforts to end the bombardment of the civilian population. It demonstrated that if counterterrorism can be used by one state to violate international law, as the US and its allies did in Iraq, there was nothing to stop another powerful state, in this case Russia, invoking the same rationale. And a third very different example, I think, is the case of Tunisia. In Tunisia, democratic states have been reluctant to take practical steps to advance the likelihood of the success of a difficult democratic transition in a post-authoritarian society. Corruption, inequality, and other structural challenges have been ignored. Unfortunately, the fight against terrorism overshadowed all of these other priorities. So to conclude, trends set in motion after 9/11 have facilitated violations and enabled their perpetrators. We have seen the creation of a self-sustaining perpetual motion machine of counterterrorism that consumes and eradicates human rights in the Middle East and North Africa region. The securitized approach to counterterrorism strengthens the repressive powers of authoritarians. Global authoritarianism, sustained by the war on terrorism, now threatens Western democracies themselves. And that may provide some motivation for a much needed new approach. We must hope so. The global focus on countering terrorism has prioritized the wrong things. In the Middle East and North Africa region, it has killed many people and treated with indifference verging on contempt an historic region-wide quest for democracy and human dignity. This tragic lost opportunity has left a region more fertile for terrorism than it was in 2001. Thank you.
شكرا لك السيد نيل هيكس.
Thank you, Mr. Nino Hicks. It's very important.
It's very important what you have
mentioned.
For sure, we didn't
failed.
succeed in combating terrorism.
That we have not succeeded, at least, in fighting
we
against
are
terrorism, but
here,
perhaps fighting against terrorism
to combat terrorism as an alibi to suppress liberties and freedom. So
pressurize and to pressure
here,
the fight for freedom. Perhaps
so
one question we should ask is the following: if we have realized indeed human rights and implemented them, and if we had a genuine human rights-based approach to fighting against terrorism, maybe would have not failed. We have failed, and in this maybe all countries are responsible, and perhaps fighting for human rights was used as an excuse. We need to carry on discussing and carry on efforts in this regard. Let me say that United Nations have deployed some efforts in this regard, and Mr. Massimo Frigo will talk about the efforts conducted by the United Nations to guarantee human rights in the context of combating, she keeps saying combating corruption, because she says in Tunisia, this is the most perhaps, or the major concern today. And Mr. Frigo is the representative of human rights defenders with the United Nations. He's an international expert of law and compared law with special focus on migration issues and criminal justice and accountability. Mr. Massimo has joined the International Commission for Jurists, ICJ, with the work on human rights and the Office of Legal Policy, and for last years he's been fighting or he's been joining and supporting the efforts to join, therefore, and to support human rights. You have 10 minutes, Mr. Massimo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me and for inviting the ICJ. I hope you can hear me well. Yes. So I will try in 10 minutes to summarize the counterterrorism efforts of the United Nations and their impact on human rights. It is an Herculean task because basically in the last 20 years, the United Nations has done a lot on this, and unfortunately not, in my opinion, in the right direction. Let me anticipate, I've been working for the last 20 years on these issues of counterterrorism and human rights. So what you will hear are both the ICJ and my personal reflections. In my opinion, is when you see the United Nations counterterrorism structure, you identify two original sins that actually my predecessor, Nino Hicks, identified. Number one, we see that even at the United Nations, there was an adoption of the US paradigm of war paradigm, of the fact that counterterrorism was considered within the peace and security actions, within the war action. And that already created the frame, which is different from the counterterrorism frame that was preceding 9/11, which was the ordinary organized crime way, the criminal justice framework. That is, I think, one of the original sin. The other original sin we see reflected is the duality that was created between security and human rights. This conviction that you cannot have human rights and security at the same time. And this contrast is something that actually has created a lot of the abusive measures and policies that Mr. Hicks has actually explained before me. So how do we start? It's interesting to have a reflection on that, because in reality, the events of the last 2 months bring us to a full cycle. Because the UN started really to deal with counterterrorism with the framework we are used to now, this peace and security framework, with the Security Council getting involved in 1999. The first resolution is 1267 against the Taliban. That's actually the first, at the beginning of the UN sanction regime, it's a sanction list against the Taliban for hosting Osama bin Laden. This exactly is the origin of the system. After 9/11, first reaction, resolution 1373, the UN Security Council under Chapter 7, which, as you know, it makes binding its resolution on all member states, obliges all member states to deter people and freeze funding for all people that may be supporting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, to make measures to repress these movements and to avoid any travel for these people. This is the beginning of the UN counterterrorism structure. We are talking about a structure which at the beginning was very small and now is actually $1 million structure in New York. So really the evolution of this system is enormous. We talk about 20 years ago, the UN didn't have a counterterrorism office, and counterterrorism was developed in Vienna by the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes, which is the office which supports prosecutors, police officers, judges to fight organized crime. They had a terrorism division. Since 9/11, we have actually the counterterrorism structure that starts under the Security Council, which up to that moment was dedicated to peacekeeping operations. So already the philosophy behind it was absolutely different. And these resolutions were resolutions which were supported by the entirety of the UN system and the UN member states. Let's not forget that even China and Russia at the time were not opposed to these measures. Russia was dealing with the war in Chechnya, the second war in Chechnya. China was already dealing with the problem of Xinjiang. So we are talking about a structure in which, in reality, the US was the driving force, but there was a genuine interest on all players and all the permanent five members to actually have this system run and working. It is of the same period, the institution by the G7, then there was the G8, the 8 most important countries, because Russia was still part of it, of the Financial Action Task Force. That was an institution that still existed for money laundering, again, crime prevention reasons. The competence was extended to financing of terrorism. If someone has explored the last 20 years of counterterrorism lawmaking in most countries, you will discover that this institution is one of the most influential institutions to actually enact legislation. We can, as even the special rapporteur on counterterrorism and human rights can actually propose legislation which is human rights compliant. But if the Financial Action Task Force, as happened recently in Turkey, pushes for a certain kind of legislation, this is done usually in a couple of months for the simple reason that otherwise banks from Western countries are foreclosed from doing bank transfers. So there is a huge system of pressure and implementation that goes from the level. And that's already a field in which civil society and certain organizations have worked hardly to add certain human rights safeguards. And now they exist to try to avoid that civil society is actually considered into the measures for counterterrorism, although they are not working that much. So this is already the situation of 20 years ago. States that are mandated by the Council and obliged by the Security Council to enact counterterrorism measures. And how did states react? States reacted by having a lot of legislation inspired either from Western countries, as the UK, France, many European countries started enacting legislation which was potentially very dangerous for freedom of expression, freedom of association, and also for the right to liberty. And these were cut and paste in many countries, but without any check and balances and judicial guarantees to be able to counterbalance. Furthermore, other countries, I bring the example, for example, of Indonesia, that just come to mind, Malaysia, started to resort to criminal offenses of the colonial period, like the Internal Security Act, that were used actually against civil society. So the impact was immediate. And the United Nations Security Council said unwanted. We had a huge research at the time on that to actually have a scooping on that, and we found a massive amount of violations. This is the system that started. Then, of course, this was the era of Al-Qaeda, the era of the Taliban at the time. Then we go towards the end of the Bush era, with the starting of the Obama era. And already there, with the killing of Osama bin Laden, we are talking of the end of this. Suddenly, ISIS comes into play. And ISIS has a very different pattern from the system of Al-Qaeda, which is it had a territorial dimension. So there was an absolute difference in approach. And that the Security Council did something that's never happened in the history of the United Nations, a Security Council resolution that obliged states to directly implement criminal law offenses. It has never happened that the Security Council basically wrote the text of a criminal law offense and told countries, you implement it as written in this resolution, because that's actually an infringement of the principle of legality. But the foreign terrorist fighter, which is a concept now familiar to anyone, it's a concept invented by the Security Council at the time, which has expanded and actually has increased the number of offenses for travel, for indirect support, which in many countries now are used to tackle people which have barely something to do with genuine terrorism offenses. So that was the second system of slippery slope. And every single time there has been this step, the architecture, the counterterrorism architecture within the UN got bigger. This is the time in which the Counterterrorism Center was created with official backing, because it was really official of Saudi Arabia. It originally was in Riyadh. And these are centers that were supposed to actually bring on the capacity building to implement all these regulations. Finally, we get to the moment of today. And here we talk about the period where there started to be the attacks of ISIS in Paris, the height of ISIS, but also the beginning of the end of ISIS. And a new paradigm starts, the paradigm of countering or preventing violent extremism. This is the new angle which started to enter also in Human Rights Council resolution, in the General Assembly counterterrorism strategy, which is a concept which is hard to define. When someone asks to anyone, what is violent extremism, you may have a feeling about it, but legally speaking, there is no definition of the concept as such. And that is highly problematic because many civil society are perceived in certain countries as being extremist, potentially. And the violence factor in several countries may be considered also from a verbal or an attack on object perspective, instead of actually a physical violence one. So it is a concept which is very much prone to abuse, which has been adopted by certain systems of the United Nations, which has been harshly criticized by the UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights, who's the watchdog of the Human Rights Council on this system. And now we are at the end of this cycle. In a sense, as you have seen, the Taliban are back. They have conquered Kabul. No one is talking anymore about the fact that some of them are on the UN counterterrorism list. There are talks of recognition of any government, etc., of dialogue. And the question is, what's going to be next for the UN counterterrorism structure? Recently, discussions at the UN Human Rights Council, like in New York, are around this concept of extremism, negative effects. And the question is really, are these concepts going to be used to expand even more the measures of control, of expansions? Because there is anyway a big structure that needs to survive. Or are we going to start to talk about what some people call root causes without going into it? Are human rights violations some of the causes that create violence, that creates repression, that then may pop up into certain terrorist techniques? I will end up by saying that, by answering to the question that our panelist was saying before, what happened if we had done human rights would have been better? I think the situation would have been easier if human rights, civil and political, but particularly economic, social, and cultural rights had been the forefront of the strategy. And if counterterrorism had been dealt as a criminal justice phenomenon solely, even by collaborating internationally, that would have changed the dimension. It wouldn't have created and made disappear terrorism forever, because as a really intelligent, I think, Italian geopolitical strategist said, terrorism is not an entity, terrorism is a strategy. And an awful, criminal, and barbarous strategy. But it may happen that it's resorted to in different times of history in different ways. And it is not by thinking that a war can be led against it that terrorism can disappear. I think it's about enforcing people and the rule of law that we can make it insignificant, and that's how we win against terrorism. Thank you very much. I hope that was of any use.
مدام بشرى يمكن يجب وضع الميكروفون.
Mrs. Bochra, Madame Bochra, vous avez oublié votre micro. Thank you, Massimo, for your presentation, where you insisted on the approach that would perhaps be more human rights prone, and also on some of the UN approaches. But basically, I think it's a security approach, which is not a preventive approach that at the same time insists and protects human rights. I think this requires a collective effort, not on the part of UN institutions or other countries, but also from CSOs, because they have a role to play as regards the dissemination of human rights culture so that we protect ourselves from terrorism and from actually turning a whole society under the pressure of fear into a terrorist society, because you know, in Tunisia, despite all the advances and progress that we have done in freedoms and human rights, we feel that sometimes society itself is under the impact and effect of terror or fear, is ready to surrender some of its human rights, and perhaps even calls for expeditive, let's say, trials, so that all those who are accused of terrorism are sometimes considered as terrorists, and some people call even for capital punishment to be applied on them. So yes, and this is a country that has been experimenting only recently with the freedom of expression, and as you can see, human rights culture and the guarantee of national, let's say, propensity towards respecting human rights is not there. You can see that we are not yet in a position where we can claim that we have generations that are far and aloof from any culture of violence, because when we talk about terrorism, also we need to talk about extremism and violence at the same time. Now, let me give the floor to those who are following these discussions. Perhaps some of you would like to take the floor. We have a button that you can click on at the lower end of your screen, or perhaps you can insert your questions in the chat box or comments on the two presentations that we have been listening to. Masoud? I do feel that you want to talk, Masoud. Perhaps I need to listen more to them. But if nobody wants to take the floor, I can talk. Give us an appetizer, she says.
Well, I'm going to speak in English. So thank you for both speakers. I think they're very important. I've read yesterday the paper that has been given by Neil, and it was excellent. It means it summarized almost everything. I'm going to start from my experience myself. In 2016, I've written a paper, 20-page paper for the Cairo Institute about terrorism. And then I gave witnesses about what happened. I mean, I visited twice young people who were in Kasserine and Hay Zuhur, and who participated in the revolution, and I mean, they were very active. And then later on, I tried to visit the place, and then I told that most of the young people you knew, now they are, I mean, in the mosque of Hay Zuhur, and they are in 2012, they belong to these extremist groups, and some of them went to Syria. And at that time in Bochra knows, 2012, 2013, there were waves of Tunisians who went to Syria, Iraq, and Libya, and we were considered to be from revolting people for democracy and the human rights to young people who are really, we were champions of people who went to Syria, to Iraq, etc. I'm not going to give the whole causes, but I think from what I heard from people in Spitla, Kasserine, and other places, is that the feelings of despair, of hopelessness, can turn into some type of violence. This violence can be expressed through what Bouazizi did, for example, through self-immolation. That's one type of expressing despair. It can be expressed through undocumented migration, and that's another aspect of that. Or it can be expressed. So I have seen from the young people that I talked to, and there were many of them that I talked to, most of them they don't believe in those imams, etc. But inside them, there is a sort of revenge from a state that did not take care of them, that their disillusion, their despair inside them is expressed through that. So I'm not saying that the social, economic, and social rights are the most important, but they are very, very important. So how are we going to answer that? We, beside what Bochra has been speaking about, which is the fact that most of the public opinion is against what type of terrorism is against us as human rights. Whenever we speak about, for example, a fair trial for terrorists, you have the answer, waves of answers to say, no, you have to really, you have to kill them all, etc. So what I'm saying, you have two problems. The first problem, how to deal with these problems, with these aspirations, etc. This is the first thing. The second thing is what Mr. Massimo was speaking about, and then Neil in his paper was speaking about. How can we really balance between these, the fact that you really protect the people against terrorism and at the same time protect the human rights? But because what we are saying from September 11, 2001 until now, we are seeing the fact that most of the time, whenever you speak of terrorism, you forget about the human rights. But when we are relaxed like this, we can speak about it. But then later on, when we have terrorism, you have to stop, and then you have to think about only protection. And the third thing is what's been referred to by Neil before, which is the fact that many, like in Syria or in Egypt or any other place, Ben Ali was doing the same thing, and Bochra knew, and his anti-terrorist law in 2004. He is taking everybody, every human right, every activist to be a potential terrorist. And that's, I mean, so you have, and unfortunately, and this is my last sentence, unfortunately, lately, human rights has been shrinking to give place to other things. And the more you have terrorism through the world, the less people think about the human rights, etc. And this is really to be our problem as a human rights activist. Thank you, Bochra.
مال أستاذ ذرتك. شكرا مسعود. أستاذ
Thanks,
ذرتك.
Masoud. Professor Ratib, can you hear me?
نعم مسموع.
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you very much for me, Massimo, and Mr. Masoud. Thank you, Mrs. Bochra. What I want to say about this subject,
that terrorism that
the terrorism we are
witnessing the last
witnessing
period
actually
has
is a common ground or
or
a
a
mobile
common, let's say, driver
with the struggle for
the,
freedom. Terrorism,
liberation,
as it was mentioned by
with the
Massimo,
liberation
is a strategy, is a
trend.
plan.
As he said,
Therefore, this
Mr. Masoud,
strategy
terrorism
has
has a strategy.
an objective,
This
and the
strategy has
announced
a specific
objective for the
aim, and the
terrorism and
strategy
the
for
Al-Qaeda terrorism,
Al-Qaeda
and
and for
also for the
9/11 operation that
9/11
took place
also
in the US, in
terrorist
New York.
attacks in New York, is
The idea
absolutely
is to redress a wrong that is
remedy
done.
for an
So
injustice. So this common ground for the struggle for
combat for freedom
liberties
and for the terroristic strategy is what explains the first point explained by Professor Bill. The compliance between the fighters or defenders of human rights with the terrorists. I think it's important with regards to combating for human rights. It's important to have a position as regards authority, oppression, and terrorism. We need to have the same position. Let's not fall in the same trap as the one that Khashoggi. That's not the fall in the trap of where Jamal Khashoggi fell, because he fought for terrorism in Syria and he was a victim of it. It's not. It is because he considered that terroristic work had a liberation aim. This is why he fought for it. He fought for it.
So what I want to say that it's absolutely quite important not really to be tolerant,
to indulge
with regard to terrorism,
on the basis that
it serves a freedom cause. It will not serve a freedom cause or liberty, but it seems to serve this. Absolutely, we could apply on the Palestinian struggle for freedom. So this matter should be taken into consideration when it comes to the struggle for freedom. Thank you very much, Mr. Ratab. There's Mu'taz, Noha, and Mr. Salim, and Mrs. Noha. Then the floor, Mr. Ahmed, please. There's a lot of topics in the chat. Could you just mention it, please? Mu'taz. Thank you very much for the interventions. I've got some comments. They are not really questions in order to prompt the discussions. I'm not going to talk about the impact, about the idea of terrorism and the human rights. This is quite clear, and we could see it day to day. So in Nigeria, we are having the discussion as some political associations are stained with it. So this is since 1992. The first law issued in 92, and the short 3 years to combat terrorism in 1998 with the same definition of terrorism in the Egyptian law. But I want also to discuss this impact of these policies in the post-Arab Spring in order to really, as an alibi for what is happening in the region, and by having the justifying, of course, the counterterrorism measures. We have seen it in Libya, we have seen it in Syria, and sometimes some parties are allied with some groups, are itself involved in what we call under the topic of combating terrorism. We have seen this in Yemen. So this matter, I think the international community is in charge, is responsible for this. In the post-September 11, I think just like the interveners, they have mentioned, this has made the confusion in the concepts. Nain has talked about the intervention in Syria, where one is supposed to talk about an intervention and then now talking about humanitarian intervention rather than counterterrorism intervention. So up the 90s, we are talking about humanitarian intervention. So now we are talking about intervention to counterterrorism with hundreds of thousands of victims in different roads. So when it comes to intervention for counterterrorism, some countries, they are calling it intervention for human rights, but in fact, they are intervening to counterterrorism. So this confusion is quite clear in the policies in the Middle East today, after 20 years, post-September 11. This is the lesson that the practices of the international policies in combating terrorism, which is quite long. I think it requires a deep review. So now if we could see UK, for example, they have absolutely this confusion about these measures. Some cases, of course, where to search the mobile phones or the computers, and then to provide large powers to the security forces. Of course, it's quite different from the MENA region, but definitely these laws are providing an alibi for the third world countries in order to really proliferate. Thank you very much, Martaz. Mrs. Noha, please, you got the floor. Thank you very much. I'm going to speak in English.
I enjoyed reading the paper. I have just a few remarks and a couple of questions. So, I mean, as somebody who works at a think tank, I've been reading a lot of pieces now about the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the 20th anniversary of the counterterrorism policies that were devised since then. And I think that, you know, one of the big problems is this perception among US policymakers in particular that counterterrorism policies have been a major success, right? Because there hasn't been another 9/11 on American soil. Therefore, they've been a success. Sure, we've made mistakes, as they call them, you know, invasion of Iraq, Guantanamo Bay, although none of the ones I've read so far have even mentioned Guantanamo Bay. But yeah, sure, there have been mistakes, but ultimately, so long as there hasn't been another 9/11 on American soil, then these policies have been a success. And so, I mean, obviously, this perception, this narrative of success among policymakers and government officials is a big problem because then there's little incentive to change. And kind of, I guess, related to this is American apathy at the societal level towards the disastrous impact of these counterterrorism policies in the rest of the world. And there's apathy because it's far from home, right? So how do you tap into the humanity of your average American? How do you garner popular support in American society to change counterterrorism policies? And I think related to this as well is perhaps there's this crisis of solidarity. I mean, you've seen Black Lives Matter. There's some sort of ad hoc alliances between Black Lives Matter and, you know, other groups that advocate for the rights of other marginalized and groups that have been discriminated against. But they've been ad hoc and dispersed. I don't see sort of a robust movement of solidarity between Americans that suffer from the militarization of U.S. foreign policy and other groups that have suffered. So how do you cultivate an effective and meaningful solidarity that may have an impact on reforming counterterrorism policies? And I think documentation is obviously the human rights movement's or one of its most powerful tools, mechanisms, weapons, whatever you want to call it. It's good for truth seeking. It's good for preserving history, for combating the erasure of history. It's good for accountability, ultimately. And I wonder I wonder if there has been any sort of systematic effort to document the perceptions of convicted terrorists. What drove them to pursue these acts? Something that would sort of make the demography of these terrorists more nuanced, right? Because they're not all clones of Osama bin Laden, obviously. And as Masoud pointed out, with regards to Tunisia, for example, it had, as far as I understand, the highest per capita number of foreign fighters in ISIS. And so, it's a much, much, much more complex story, and we all know that. But I wonder if there has been any systematic effort to document this and to showcase it. And then if there has been an effort to do this, how has this material been used to generate impact? And finally, actually, that's it. That's all I had to say. Thank you very much.
شكرا. الكلمة السيد سالم.
Thank you very much. The floor is for Mr. Salem now. Thank you very much, Mrs. Bochra. Thank you for having me. I don't have a question. I have a comment, in fact. And of course, I think my friend is going to smile about the topic. The dictator, half of the famous dictator, definitely has called one day to set a definition for terrorism. And from a different point of view, we should determine a definition for terrorism or terror, because we are using the use definition of terror, where some organizations are using it. The United Nations, which doesn't express, for example, the human rights society, because it presents countries. And if these countries in the majority, even though the human rights is optional and temporarily, France, for instance, is fighting against the terrorism, but the French government is killing much more civilians than terrorists, and it's pretending fighting terrorists. And Mali, there's nothing interesting for the French media. There's only Al-Qaeda or ISIL. There's also tribal complexity, political and economic problems and issues with regard to the tribes. So we see and we notice a simplistic approach to the fight of terror. So I think deeply, and I stress here with my great respect for UN, so we have to absolutely split the roles and to make it clear the role of the United Nations, into with regard to the international policies and terrorism. Even though, despite the fact that the democratic states, and some of them, is not compliant with the human rights. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now, with the questions of the participants, the question I'm going to answer straight away with the Tunisian law with regard to fight terrorism. And the question said, is there any possibility to review this law? In fact, we have to know that the Tunisian law to fight terrorism of 2015 was under the impact of a public opinion, followed a terrorist attack. So therefore, the politicians, all political parties included, based on a populistic speech, demanding a much more repressive laws in order to eradicate terrorism. And majority of the Tunisian society believed that there were no counterterrorism law, even though it is there from 2004. Thus, the birth of this law, with no guarantees and safeguards for human rights, which is much more severe than the Ben Ali law, which includes the capital punishment. The new law has got clauses to implement the capital law. So is it today I think it's quite necessary to review this law, especially definitely, and the necessity to review this in a quite political environment, especially from a human rights scope. I think that the situation today is not really suitable to deal with any law, because we are expecting what's going to happen at the level of institutions. So the word now is for the participants. And there's a question I'm going to address to them, but at the same time to address some topics. So the question for the participants is: the civil society in the Arab region is partly responsible for accepting the basic paradigm as it is seen by this. Is there another paradigm in favor of the upholding the rule of law in order to eradicate the political violence, if we want to override this political violence? So whoever who wants to intervene at the same time to answer the questions. Mr. Ahmed, please, if there's any question, meanwhile, please read it so that Massimo or Nate could hear it and could maybe provide with an answer. Did you hear me, Ahmed? Did you hear me, Mr. Ahmed? So the floor now for Mr. Nino Hicks.
Thank you.
Allez-y, okay.
You can hear me? Right, thank you for the questions and for the discussion. I think I will begin by responding to Noha and her question, because I think this goes to a lot of what I was talking about in my paper about the impact of US policy and how it has shaped global counterterrorism for the last 20 years. And looking back, I think, and this is what this exercise is about, really, I suppose, looking back over the 20-year period. The way the Bush administration started the war on terrorism, as I mentioned, was by linking freedom to an all-out war on terrorism. And that included violations of international law. So from the outset, they were undermining what was supposedly a pillar of their counterterrorism strategy. And this was apparent, at that time. And in those days, I was working for Human Rights First, and we were engaging with Bush administration officials. And we would tell them, yeah, it's great you want to promote democracy and human rights, but on the other hand, you've got to stop torturing people. You've got to stop having illegal wars. You've got to close Guantanamo. You've got to stop rendition. All of these things. And there was somehow it just didn't connect. I mean, there was no way to have this sort of fact-based discussion with US officials at that time. Now, as a result of that, and this is why I talk about the counterterrorism as a kind of perpetual machine. As a result of that, counterterrorism has become something which serves authoritarians, first and foremost. And they realize that today, which is why you have authoritarian governments dominating the global counterterrorism architecture of the UN in New York that Massimo was talking about. And it doesn't take much reflection, actually, to sort of look at what exceptional laws to counterterrorism do. They take away safeguards. They empower the executive. And of course, authoritarians love this. And it does away with accountability. And it also intimidates states that are supposedly in favor of liberal values, human rights standards. So it feeds on itself and has brought us to this situation. Now, Noha asked the question, how do we mobilize solidarity about this? How do we get people in the United States to be concerned about the impacts of these policies on people far away in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world? It's a very good question. But I think one way, and I think that the Biden administration in a way is sort of suggesting that it's thinking about this. I mentioned in my paper that authoritarianism on a global level, which has been empowered by the war on terrorism, is now threatening democracy in the West. And we obviously saw that with the Trump administration, and we see it in other movements in Europe and elsewhere. That, I think, is one factor that can mobilize public opinion in the West that is concerned about maintaining democratic governments in Western countries. So I think stressing that connection is important. I think in other comments, Messaoud brought up the question of economic and social rights. And again, looking back on the perspective of 20 years, of course, like 10 years after 9/11, we had the Arab Spring. And I mentioned in my paper that the reaction of the West to the Arab Spring, was dismissive largely, almost to the point of being insulting. And it was a horrible missed opportunity. What that did present at that time, 10 years ago now, was an opportunity for Western governments to rethink the approach, which was already clear was creating conflict and authoritarianism in the region. They could have listened to the aspirations of the people in the region calling for dignity primarily, and supported those efforts at the local level. But they took another path, unfortunately, and continued to almost automatically implement the securitized policies of counterterrorism. So that was a road not taken. I do think that the approach which Massimo spoke about in his presentation, Massimo mentioned too, and some of the comments also mentioned, if you can deal with terrorism as a criminal justice issue, you can have a defined crime of terrorism and policies directed towards preventing that crime. And if at the same time you can address the conditions that give rise to terrorism and create the grievances on which terrorist organizations feed, then I think there will be a more successful approach. I don't think it's an either or. I don't think you can just switch off the militarized, securitized terrorism approach. It's too ingrained. But I think we can try to build up those elements which call for counterterrorism policies within a criminal law framework, within the structures of international law, and which also give high priority to ending the types of conditions that enable terrorist groups to find recruits and to continue their attacks on people everywhere.
شكرا. Massimo,
Thank you very much. I think Massimo is going to end up this discussion by maybe answering some questions on the chat, but at the same time to answer what has been discussed already.
Thank you very much. I will try my best. The question on the chat, the one in English from Jeremy, says, unfortunately, I don't have that experience of the Arab region to have a position on what should happen in the Arab region. I can address a lot of the questions also in the discussion. Let's start with the last. I go from the back and then to the beginning. Definition of terrorism was asked whether there should be a definition. It's interesting because everyone talks about something, no one knows what's defined. The UN has been trying to get a definition of terrorism for the last at least 30 years. Actually, the reason the UN Security Council started to make resolution is because the states could not agree on a definition of terrorism. There is a convention and a discussion who's been there for decades. And the reason that there's no agreement because certain states do not want to have what is called liberation fighters, etc., in the definition, and some others say that state terrorism, which has been also mentioned, should be included in the definition. For example, in Latin America, during the 70s, there was this notion of state terrorism when the state was terrorizing the population and using terror techniques against its own people. These discussions are still there. There is a committee in the UN who's discussing this convention, and that's haven't moved for 30 years. So the reality is that we are dealing with something which at the international level is blocked. And we can deal, the UN can deal really concretely, either with politicized concept, and that's a problem, or with certain effects. So hijacking of planes, bombings, etc., with certain actions that are taken by terrorist organizations or terrorists themselves, individuals. So there is already a problem that in the collaboration. There was a question about if anyone has done research on perception of terrorists or convicted terrorists, how they think, why they did something. I think there's no global research on that, also because it's very difficult to do it. There have been some in certain contexts, and I think the drivers are very different. For example, in France and in certain European countries, there were certain research about certain attackers that would say were linked to ISIS and in the Paris attacks, etc. And it comes out that sociologically, most of the people came out not necessarily from a situation of poverty, but of social exclusion. There were people also that, because of societal upbringing, of lack of recognition into the society in which they were, they felt rejected, they felt not part of the society where they were, then they entered into criminality, drug abuse, etc., etc. And the societal dimension was explored, however, was not addressed. I don't think that's a paradigm that applies to every terrorist attackers. I think there are different things. When we talk about people who went into the conflict of Syria, I think probably that the driver is also different because it was a territory, a country, and the driver may be different. And I think that's the problem. I don't think we can get the same driver for every person who uses a terrorist technique. And unfortunately, all these terrorism policies start from the assumption that they are all the same. And I think it is different. I think Neil was much better than me to answer how to move US citizens into that. That's a big problem. One element I would add one day is that we should really enter into the issue of money. I know that's not my expertise, but how much taxpayers spend for all these constructions, etc., and then the results are what they are. And I don't think that not having an attack for 20 years is a result. So one day, probably someone better than a lawyer should look into the fact of how much this counterterrorism structure costs compared to the action they actually do. Finally, one thing about terrorism and how to tackle, for instance, I will go back on that. You were saying, our chair was saying, people very easily, as soon as they hear terrorists, in a sense, they think, why to have fair trials? Let's get the death penalty. Let's kill them all. This is the usual question that drives the fear of people. It's the same thing with a lot of serious crime that shock population. And the solution is usually the easy one because no one thinks that they will ever be part of the defendants. They think really on a Manichaean bad and right system. The reality is that exactly terrorism is as undefined and difficult as it is. And the problem is this. It is in the very definition of the word. And sometimes we should go back to the roots. Terrorism, it's clear, it's a technique to spread terror, to spread fear. And if you go back to that, to say, how do you defeat terrorism? By trying everything that decreases or avoids the fear. You're not going to get rid of the action as soon as possible, but you need to create the antibodies in society that make so that people do not react based on fear. When the society reacts and makes laws based on fear, that's already a victory. When there were the attacks in France, there were one or two counterterrorism laws every year, which was absolutely madness. And the anti-terrorism experts were the first to be shocked because they couldn't adapt and they had no chance to really actually do real counterterrorism. I want to make, sorry, there are some questions popping up. So before I finish, maybe I read them. What do I think about the extension of international conventions? Counterterrorism international conventions, they are as far as they get. They're really on specific issues, the ones that are there, hijacking, etc. As I said, there's no comprehensive one, and I don't think we are ever going to get it. There are regional ones, which may be concerning. On the Arab Spring, really, that's not my expertise. Then there is one, how can human rights organizations support civil society, which seems to be our best hope. In the US, where most people have little compasses in the region, we hear from the news of government, the states that use anti-terrorism as an excuse for the same model repressive laws are good partners. Yeah. Is there a way to bring civil society players to the attention of the public without putting them in danger? So on the putting them in danger, that depends on the country, of course. I think this last question is, if we go back to the history, it's the old music. In a sense, if we see all of the colonial times, it was exactly the same thing. Security laws that would actually repress civil society. And suddenly this, before it was the same colonial power, and now it's the partner. But the reality is that counterterrorism law, as Neil said, is used in a repressive way. To go back to my original point, and I stop speaking because I'm Italian, I speak a lot. How do we fight terrorism? I want to tell you an Italian experience of the 1970s. In the 1970s, we had, of course, it was a national terrorism, it was not an international one, but we had a lot of terrorist organizations, communist or fascist oriented. They were doing from bombings, shootings, killings in an indiscriminate way. One of them was the Red Brigades. That was a communist oriented organization. And now historians agree to trace the moment historically where the Red Brigade started to lose. And that was not the moment where there were anti-terrorism legislation. That was the moment of a trial. The trial of, in Turin, ordinary criminal trial before ordinary criminal courts in Turin against the first head of the Red Brigades. It was a trial by jury, and at a certain moment, the strategy was for them to terrorize the jurors so that they wouldn't go there and the trial could not take place. No one wanted to be a juror. Then the head of the Bar Association decided to volunteer to go there as a juror, and they got killed. Starting from that, everyone started to go there as a juror. That was the moment where the Red Brigade started to lose support. And for me, it is an extreme example of the only way to actually defeat terrorism is when people stop being afraid. So I hope that gives some ideas, but thank you very much for having me.
شكرا ماسيمو. هناك سؤال سأجيب عنه.
Thank you, Massimo. There's a question I'm going to answer regarding the role of the civil society, which I have asked before. So the answer is going through the Tunisian experience. So it's true that the Tunisian civil society absolutely hold the responsibility of not imposing another solution to combat terrorism. We should know that in Tunisia, the public opinion is under fear because of the terrorist attacks, but it echoes in parts of the media and of the populist movements, up to that we as legal activists, male and female, as if we are laundering terrorism, and we appear to be defending extremism, where we tried and we're still trying to find a different speech, which is a different approach, different to counterterrorism. But it's not quite easy at all. Mr. Massoud and Mu'taz, they know very well what's happening in Tunisia, because the populist speech has created and established a public opinion which is vehement to the human rights, because it's believing that all defending human rights is defending terror and not human rights or the basic freedoms and liberties. So imagine in Tunisia, so we are not called the legal activists, but the using a disordered word used by the media, Mu'taz using. So is someone there to depict the Assad a dictator or an authoritarian, so you are against Palestinian rights and you are with terror. So it's true that we come out of repression and the police authoritarian regime by the state, but we are under the impact of a public opinion. We could not reach, we didn't succeed, in fact, to convince that the human rights really matters. And some youth is against human rights and is he himself suffering from violations of human rights. He cannot imagine that these rights that we are defending, it's one of the rights that we are defending without naming it. So the civil society, what we need here, what we are missing is to think about a new speech, because maybe we are in need in Tunisia specifically, we are in the front of the populist vague and the populist, which is really attracting the public and the masses. So we are thinking of a new paradigm that could reach the public, and the public should understand that human rights is really quite interesting for each one of them, and anytime is subjected to violations of his basic rights. So we got the S-17, which is a measure preventing people from traveling without any justification or any legal cover. So you cannot imagine how the public opinion considers this is a really very common and normal security measure. So definitely you cannot imagine the drama caused by these violations. So for the public opinion in general and the politicians, they are intervening really in a wrong way. We could see it that the politicians, they are using this measures, the security measures, in order to absolutely argue against human rights. So this is a condemnation for everybody, and it's used by a large number, and it's abusively used in some case, even when it comes to the public administration or the security services. It's quite true. We are in a very difficult situation. It's quite true that we are having a responsibility. Hopefully that we could think more about one of the ways to enhance this condition. Finally, I would like to thank Mr. Frigo and Nino Hicks, as I would like to thank all the participants, the followers, and my apologies for the participants because of the time, which was absolutely not permitting to answer all the questions. I think the topic deserves more than 1 hour, 25 minutes. So therefore the floor, we should provide the floor, maybe those who participating with us, they have absolutely asked interesting questions. Hopefully we have another opportunity to carry on the discussions and to deepen the discussions in order to enable the participants, you know, to ask their questions, or maybe to come up with some solutions. And as we have seen, some they are having some solutions to address the topic. Thank you very much. Hopefully to have other opportunities. So it was a very nice opportunity to do today. I have seen so many friends, but also I have met new friends. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.